2024 is the biggest election year in global history.
And many of the several billion voters casting ballots are throwing their support behind the so-called far right.
The far right has gained ground in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe. Across the continent, far-right parties have a significant foothold in many national parliaments, and some are already in power. But what role has economics played in driving their popularity?
They've been very successful in recruiting votes from voters with low economic prospects, in jobs and sectors generally in decline.
Does economics matter? Of course. What it really does, particularly for those who are insecure, is it drives a lot of the salience of these authoritarian populist parties.
What do the parties themselves say about the economy?
You watch what happens. If I win, we're going to bring those miners back. You're going to be so proud of your president. You're going to be so proud of your country.
In the sense that the economy is for them basically an extension of the culture war.
And how do business leaders feel about the prospect of governments led by the far right?
If a party like the AfD says, we need to get out of the European Union, we're against the European Union, this is very harmful to my business.
Answers to these questions and more on Business Beyond.
We hear the term far right a lot nowadays. You're going to hear it a lot in this episode. But what does it actually mean? And is it the right term to use?
In the EU, political parties affiliated to a group in the European Parliament called Identity and Democracy are routinely labelled as far right. Some of the themes which bind them: nationalism, strong anti-immigration sentiment, and Euroscepticism. So we're talking about parties such as France's National Rally, the Netherlands' Party for Freedom, along with several others across the EU. Many designate Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban as far right. It's also used for Germany's AfD, Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the US, and at times, even with the Conservative Party in the UK.
But some experts say the term far right doesn't work anymore. One is the political scientist Pippa Norris from Harvard University.
I try to avoid it, basically, because I don't think it's very accurate. It's an old-fashioned term, because Europeans used to think of everything in left-right ever since the French Revolution. And that made some sense when you had conservative Christian Democrats and you had social democrats and socialist parties. Nowadays, it's more complicated.
She thinks classic left-right divides over the economy are gradually being superseded by a split over cultural issues.
And it's a wide range of issues, on issues like, for example, abortion or reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, nationalism versus cosmopolitanism, human rights versus a sense of a strong state.
It helps explain why you're probably more likely to hear politicians like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban decrying the so-called woke agenda than discussing economic policy.
Some people, again, talk about populism, which is a very vague term, but really it's about the values, about the moral issues and the social issues which divide society. And classically, of course, that includes immigration in Europe, but many other issues that go along that. But I think nowadays the idea that there's a simple unidimensional left-right spectrum is more misleading and confuses more than actually helps us to understand why these parties appeal to a wide variety of different voters.
Let's drill a little deeper into this idea that it is culture, rather than the economy, which has driven support for these parties. Philip Rathgeb is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and he has studied far-right parties in detail. I asked him to what extent economic policy motivates these parties and their voters.
So they had their first electoral breakthroughs in the 80s and the 1990s. And that was a context where the economy was very much depoliticized, in the sense that there was a market-conforming consensus, an economically liberal consensus that depoliticized the economy and thereby opened the door for the politicization of other issues. That is immigration, asylum, gender, identity. And these are the issues on which these parties are in a good position to mobilize. That's their territory. That's their home turf, if you will.
Pippa Norris says the issue of immigration in particular shows how it is culture, rather than economics, which motivates voters to support these parties.
She points to the success of anti-immigrant parties in EU countries where the economy has performed relatively strongly over recent decades.
Think about the countries which have had tremendous economic growth and a fairly generous welfare state. Think about Sweden, think about Denmark, think about the Netherlands, and think about Germany. And all of those are ones which weren't that affected by the euro crisis. In all of these countries I just mentioned, in the affluent north of Europe, there's been a strong party which has emerged in each case.
However, immigration is still connected to economic issues for some far-right supporters.
In Northern Europe, they don't go against foreign goods because they have export surpluses. They don't go against foreign capital because they have a solid, loyal employer and business class. But they go against foreign people in the sense that what they mobilize on is welfare chauvinism. Because these countries, they have relatively high levels of immigration, but also relatively high levels of welfare. So here the nationalist impulse goes against welfare entitlements for foreigners.
But the experts we spoke to believe that economic indicators do not determine where the far right will be strong.
Economic inequality at the objective level, measured by, for example, inflation, jobs, or unemployment, or other indicators such as GDP growth or GDP levels, does not predict where you see these parties emerging.
But are there still economic factors which determine why certain voters go with the far right? After the Brexit and Trump votes in 2016, a common narrative was that it was disenfranchised, poorer voters who had secured the paths to victory.
There certainly is a correlation, but we should also not underestimate to what extent right-wing populism is attractive to not only sort of the lower income or deindustrialized voter base.
That's Liana Fix, a historian and political scientist. And she says it's important to note that far-right parties pick up support from voters of various socio-economic backgrounds.
Crunching down the numbers, there's also significant support for right-wing parties that comes from middle class, sort of higher middle class, and also not underestimate that it's not the fault of the poor who are only working for the populists, voting for the populists or for the extremists. There are also other voters that are attracted by these parties.
These voters are not the poor. So the poor, either they vote for the left or they don't vote at all. So the poor have really a low level of turnout. And so what the radical right is that their electoral stronghold is rather among the lower middle class and working class.
While many far-right parties grew in the decade which followed the global financial crisis, those we spoke to believe it was the refugee crisis of 2015 which ultimately drove them to their current positions of prominence, in Europe at least.
I mean, it was after that, in 2015, that we could see an electoral breakthrough of the AfD in Germany, of the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, of Vox in Spain, of Chega in Portugal. I think the financial crisis led to a broader decline of the political mainstream in favor of the left and the right, whereas the refugee crisis was a catalyst for the radical right more specifically, as we could see the rise of radical right parties that didn't really exist, or there were fringe parties before the refugee crisis.
But when these parties do speak about the economy, what do they say? They obviously don't all speak with one voice, and they have their own domestic agendas. But there are some areas where they tend to agree, and one is a strong opposition to globalization.
During his successful 2016 US presidential election campaign, Donald Trump tapped into apparent voter frustration around a globalized economy.
Our politicians have aggressively pursued a policy of globalization, moving our jobs, our wealth, and our factories to Mexico and overseas. Globalization has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy. I used to be one of them.
Others, such as France's Marine Le Pen, have used the word globalization as a catch-all term to reflect many of what she sees as society's ills.
The political choice that the French people will have to make is clear. Mr. Macron is the candidate of liberalization, wild globalization, insecurity, social brutality, the war of all against all, the economic ransacking of our large corporations.
Liana Fix says the backlash against globalization has now become quite mainstream, but that the idea chimes strongly with an economic idea central to far-right movements: national self-sufficiency.
The criticism that the right wing makes is linked to a more cultural idea of, well, why don't we go back to the golden age, which has never existed, of the nation state, where every country can decide whatever they want to do from themselves and is not dependent on other countries. And that is obviously an illusion. That age has never really existed. International trade always played an important role for any nation state.
But being opposed to globalization goes well with another thread common to far-right movements: nostalgia for old industry and a pledge to bring it back.
There's a host of research showing how these voters, lower middle class, working class, have experienced status anxieties, in the sense that they are in jobs that come under pressure from deindustrialization, from technological change, from globalization.
Trump himself said he was going to stand for the coal miners of Virginia and for the Rust Belt in Michigan. And to some extent that did play with his base. And people often said, well, look, he probably can't restore manufacturing industry, but at least he speaks for us. He speaks for our concerns.
Another part of the anti-globalization backlash among far-right movements is opposition to multilateralism. In Europe, that typically means fierce opposition to the EU.
There used to be an agreement, for example, about Europe, the benefits of being in the European Union, and there was very little question about that. The idea was you'd have free markets in the European Union, and you'd have basically a variety of different standards as well that could be set and could be regulated within that.
Since the 2016 Brexit vote, various far-right parties in Europe have flirted with anti-EU positions, although some notice a softening since the turbulence of the UK's exit.
Not all far-right parties in Europe demand, for example, the end of the European Union. Giorgia Meloni, for instance, has adapted her approach and is trying to change the European Union from within, and seems to be much more mainstream than what was expected. Marine Le Pen in France also has stopped the rhetoric against the rhetoric in favor of leaving the European Union, but is sort of arguing for a new European Union.
One party whose anti-EU position has not softened much is Germany's Alternative für Deutschland, or the AfD, currently the second most popular party in the country going by opinion polls. That party was founded in 2013 in response to the Eurozone crisis.
Understandably, it has fiercely Eurosceptic roots, which it has held onto, whilst also developing a broader, nationalistic, anti-immigration philosophy.
They are still explicitly radicalizing and have sort of not toned down the language both towards the European Union.
The AfD still regularly touts the prospect of a referendum on Germany's EU membership. It also wants the country to leave the euro currency area, and those positions haven't harmed the party's popularity.
Since July 2022, support for the AfD in nationwide opinion polls more than doubled to a high of 22% in January 2024. That's come down by a few points since, but the party is currently the second most popular in Germany. But the AfD is beset by controversy. They are officially designated as a suspected extremist organisation. This year, there have been huge protests calling for them to be banned. One of the main reasons was a secret meeting the party was involved in last November with several right-wing extremists. Among the reported topics, a plan for the mass deportation of foreigners and even German citizens with a foreign background.
The controversies have even led to the AfD being ostracised by others on the European far right. They were recently kicked out of the European Parliament grouping for far-right parties due to comments made by one of their leading candidates for that parliament, which appeared to play down Nazi war crimes.
the AfD is becoming ever more radicalized, whereas other far-right parties in Europe are trying to become more mainstream and therefore to appeal to more voters.
We asked the AfD for an interview about their economic policies. And while the party did offer us the chance to speak with one of their MEPs, they wanted to approve any answers we used after the interview. When we instead sent a list of questions to the party press office, a spokesperson responded, "We just don't feel comfortable talking to DW."
The party lists many of its key economic policies on its website. Among their most prominent positions, reduce VAT and don't increase taxes, overhaul the German tax system and leave the Eurozone. The party's Parliamentary Working Group on the Economy says the following: the AfD Parliamentary Group stands for the social market economy. It is the basis of German prosperity and thus our social cohesion. We see it as our task to make the social market economy future-proof. But critics say their economic policies would not benefit their voters.
Their policies actually translated would mean that the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. And that's quite surprising that although official sort of policies and declarations would actually not favor those who feel left behind by the economy, they sort of, through other topics like immigration and so on, they still appeal to those voters who don't seem to take a close look at what exactly those economic policies will lead to.
And parties like the AfD have a big problem when it comes to the economy. By and large, business says it doesn't want them in power. A recent survey from the German Economic Institute, which polled around 900 companies, found that 75% of business executives in Germany are openly opposed to the party.
Ramona Mainzer is one such business owner who sees the AfD as a direct threat to Germany's economic prosperity. She's the owner and managing director of Aumüller, a medium-sized manufacturing enterprise in the southern state of Bavaria.
If there's a party that, for example, like the AfD says, okay, we should get out of the European Union or the euro is a bad idea, it would really, really harm my business on that one side. But on the other side also, as I'm dependent on the international markets, like for selling my products, but also for bringing international or workers with international background to Germany, we have to make sure that this wonderful country is pictured in the right way also abroad.
She also thinks the AfD's rhetoric on migrants makes Germany a less appealing place for people from abroad to come and work in. A problem, given Germany's much publicised labour shortages.
It's getting harder and harder to really find enough people to be able to keep growing, which at the end of the day is so important for my business. And so it's unbelievably important that we show Germany to other countries and people in other countries as the wonderful country that it is. So and to show them that they're welcome here and to make sure that we integrate them and that they have a chance to really build their future in this country.
Far-right parties have faced resistance from business elsewhere, but in the case of Meloni in Italy and Orban in Hungary, they have also found ways to work with business, and business has found ways to work with them.
So there is an ambiguous relationship with business. On the one hand, business may well side with the radical right when it comes to taxation and when it comes to welfare. If we look to Hungary, what Orban did was to introduce a flat tax. The Lega wants to introduce a flat tax. They can't for fiscal reasons. Meloni wants to lower taxes and lower also minimum income scheme in the interest of business.
Yet, internationally oriented companies are always likely to have a problem with far-right movements, as the AfD are finding out.
They feel uneasy about the rise of the radical right in the sense that what these parties do, and Trump is perhaps the key example in this regard, is to disrupt free trade by stimulating a turn towards economic protectionism and economic nationalism, which is not in the interest of export-oriented companies.
The rise of the far right in Europe has raised the spectre of the 1920s and 1930s, when economic crises such as unemployment and hyperinflation helped bring in fascist rule.
But there are two key differences between the economies of the 1920s and the 2020s: employment and welfare.
While inflation is still high, surprisingly, we have rather a labor problem in Europe. So unemployment is very low, and companies are really searching for labor. So that is a big difference here. The other example, or the other difference to that historical period, is that sort of social welfare structures in Europe are very strong, and there was a big pandemic support package that tried to make sure, both for companies but also for individual citizens, that tried to make sure to prevent exactly this sort of sliding down into unemployment, sliding down into economic crisis, and then to radicalization.
However, if an economic crisis were to emerge that threatened employment and the capacity of states to provide welfare, far-right parties are well placed to capitalise.
That's obviously a nightmare that is haunting many politicians today, that an economic crisis or even an economic downturn, not as big as the economic crisis in 1929, could repeat itself and could lead to the rise of right-wing parties in Europe.
For now, far-right parties in Europe and elsewhere are thriving on issues away from the economy.
And when you look at their rhetoric, yes, many of the economic issues are part of their themes, but they're not really the mainstream theme. In many, many cases, it's the cultural issues, which is where they have their bread and butter, where they have issue ownership, where they really manage to stir up passions and stir up their base support, which become loyalists towards those parties.
There's a famous phrase attributed to the American political strategist James Carville, "the economy's stupid," which means that it's the economy which matters most to voters, even when that's not always readily apparent.
The rise of the far right suggests that "it's the culture stupid" may be a more appropriate political aphorism for our present age of discord and division. Not that the economy will ever be too far away either.
That's all from this episode of Business Beyond. For more from us, check out our playlist in the video description. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, take care.